You wake up in a cold, drafty stone chamber somewhere in medieval Europe. The air smells faintly of mildew, wood smoke, and an indefinable mixture of damp fabric and human regret. The walls around you are bare stone, rough, unyielding, and about as cozy as a tax audit. Your breath hangs in the air like a sad little ghost as you realize there's no central heating. No radiators humming softly to themselves, no electric blanket warming your toes. Just cold, hard rock. You wrap your arms around yourself, trying to remember why anyone thought this was a good idea. This is your life. This is medieval living. Your mattress smells like betrayal, straw stuffed into a sack, maybe last stuffed a decade ago. No Uber. Just sandals and blisters. No avocado toast, either. Just barley mush and bad decisions. And then you notice the tapestries. They hang from the walls like faded, heavy blankets embroidered with scenes of hunts, battles, or weird allegorical nonsense involving knights and unicorns. They're the only thing standing between you and the biting cold. You reach out and touch the fabric. It's rough but somehow comforting, a quiet reminder that at least someone once cared enough to make this place a bit less miserable. So before you get too comfortable, though it's not exactly a choice, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world as we slowly peel back the layers of medieval wall decoration, one tapestry at a time. You might think tapestries were just fancy decorations, a bit like hanging your favorite band's poster on your wall, but with more thread and less teenage angst. Nope. Those heavy woven beasts were a medieval multi-tool, insulation, status symbol, propaganda billboard, and sometimes a desperate cry for warmth in a world where central heating was basically a wizard's trick. Imagine a castle in winter, giant stone walls, the thickness of an angry bear's paw, soaking up every shred of heat from your fire, then spitting it back out like a stone furnace of doom. Without something soft to cover the walls, you might as well be living inside an ice cube. So the tapestries padded the stone, helping to trap heat and block drafts. A medieval equivalent of your favorite fuzzy blanket, except instead of Netflix, you get knights chasing deer or saints doing saintly things. Now, it's easy to picture medieval folks as just cranky peasants with less hygiene than a modern-day subway, but hang on. These tapestries were expensive, precious, and a big deal. They were hand-woven with silk, wool, and sometimes even gold or silver threads, making them basically the medieval version of a Tesla, but for walls. Owning a tapestry said you had money, taste, and a solid understanding that freezing to death inside your own home is not a great look. Also, these tapestries weren't just about comfort or showing off. They told stories. They were medieval graphic novels, except instead of superheroes or celebrities, you got biblical tales, royal propaganda, or mythological adventures. A tapestry could immortalize a king's victory, a noble family's lineage, or just a weird story about a lady riding a unicorn. Because nothing says power like a giant fabric unicorn. The process of making these tapestries was an ordeal in itself. It could take months, even years, for a team of artisans to create a single piece. They used natural dyes made from plants, insects, and minerals, which sometimes meant the colors faded into soft pastels over time, though some still remained surprisingly vibrant, like a medieval Instagram filter, but without the hashtag #NoFilter. Touching these tapestries today, you can feel the weight of history, literally. They are thick, heavy, and slightly scratchy. They smell like old secrets and forgotten fires. You might find yourself wondering about the hands that wove them, the countless hours spent in dimly lit workshops, the gossip, the aching backs, and the occasional tea break involving something vaguely resembling coffee. But it wasn't all beauty and warmth. These wall hangings could also be a little bit creepy. Ever seen a medieval tapestry with a dozen tiny, bug-eyed monsters crawling around a saint? Yeah, that was intentional. Sometimes they serve to remind viewers of moral lessons, or that hell might be just a tapestry away, lurking behind your bed. And while you're cozying up next to these ancient blankets, consider the smell. Stone walls might be cold, but they're also thirsty. They absorb smoke, cooking odors, and the occasional medieval version of bad breath. Tapestries soak that up, too. So, the smell of your favorite knight's latest battle might have mingled with a faint whiff of goat cheese and sweaty socks from 3 centuries ago. As the fire crackles in the hearth, casting flickering shadows over the embroidered scenes, you realize that medieval people might have been onto something. They couldn't change the stone or the chill, but they could soften their world with art, warmth, and a little bit of storytelling woven into every thread. So next time you're struggling to get comfortable on a cold night, think of those tapestries, thick, heavy, and stubbornly clinging to the hope that someone somewhere might actually appreciate the effort. Because in a world without heating, hot water, or even decent shoes, a tapestry was more than just fabric. It was a lifeline. And if you're still awake after all that, congratulations. You've survived your first encounter with medieval wall decor. Just remember, the next chapter promises even more threads to unravel, stories to warm you, and maybe a few more reasons to appreciate your electric blanket. When you're ready, just say the word, and we'll dive back in. For now, let your mind drift like the gentle flicker of the firelight on the tapestry's worn threads, and let the quiet weight of history lull you closer to sleep. You blink slowly, still nestled in that chilly medieval chamber, the tapestry's course weave brushing lightly against your fingertips. The fire sputters, casting wavering shadows that make those stitched knights and mythical beasts seem just a little more alive. You realize something. Those tapestries were not just wall decor, they were medieval Wi-Fi, connecting everyone from the lord of the manor to the lowliest servant with stories, warnings, and a hefty dose of social signaling. But how exactly did tapestries become the cozy, fancy, multi-purpose essentials of medieval life? Let's unravel that yarn. First, picture medieval society as a giant, complicated soap opera with castles instead of mansions and peasants instead of interns. Everyone had a role, a title, and an entire wardrobe of social drama. Nobles needed to prove they were wealthy, powerful, and cultured. You couldn't just shout, "Hey, I'm rich," in the courtyard without sounding like a desperate town crier. So instead, you covered your walls with tapestries that screamed luxury, education, and good taste. It was like plastering your Instagram with photos of vacations no one else could afford, but instead of likes, you got respect and maybe fewer attempts on your life. These tapestries often depicted biblical scenes or heroic legends, which served two purposes. 1. They reminded everyone that the Lord's family was divinely favored or at least literate enough to pretend. 2. They were a sort of ancient propaganda, subtly flexing political alliances or territorial claims. Imagine a tapestry where King Arthur is jousting next to your family crest. That's basically medieval name-dropping. Yeah, my ancestors hung out with the Round Table. No big deal. But it wasn't just about bragging rights. In a world where most people couldn't read, these grand, detailed tapestries were visual storytelling on steroids. If you were the average medieval peasant, you might spend hours staring at one, piecing together stories of saints, battles, and mythical creatures. It was like binge-watching a mini-series, except your screen was a few square meters of woven wool and silk, and the plot involved a lot more sword swings and less character development. And speaking of characters, these tapestries didn't shy away from drama. Imagine a tapestry showing a nobleman smiting his enemies or a saint triumphing over a dragon. The details were often so vivid you could almost hear the clash of swords and the roar of the crowd. The artisans who made these works had to be master storytellers, skilled in weaving, dyeing, and a flair for the dramatic. They were the original screenwriters and special effects teams, working without computers or even electricity, just their hands, their skills, and probably a lot of bad posture. Now, about the comfort factor, because yes, warmth was a big deal. Stone walls are excellent at sucking the heat right out of the room, and castles in winter were basically iceboxes. Tapestries, with their thick layers of wool and silk, acted like medieval insulation panels. They trapped heat inside, blocked drafts, and made rooms feel less like frozen caves. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of thermal curtains, but way more artistic and considerably heavier. Imagine you're sitting in the Great Hall, surrounded by tapestries that shield you from the biting cold outside. The fire crackles, the scent of roasting meat drifts through the air, and the fabric walls hum with stories. Without those tapestries, you'd be shivering, grumbling, and probably very unpopular at dinner. They were practical luxury, the kind of thing that makes you feel fancy while simultaneously saving your toes from frostbite. But of course, medieval life was never simple, and tapestries came with their quirks. They were heavy, cumbersome, and a royal pain to clean. Washing them was not an option. Imagine trying to hose down something made of silk and wool that took years to make. Instead, they were aired out, occasionally brushed, and sometimes treated with vinegar or other strange-smelling concoctions to keep moths and mold at bay. which means the smell of a tapestry was often a complex bouquet of animal fibers, dust, and whatever the medieval equivalent of Febreze was. Spoiler, probably not very pleasant. Another fun fact, tapestries could also be portable. Yes, you heard that right. Nobles often took their precious tapestries on the road when moving between castles or hunting lodges. Think of them as the medieval version of a security blanket, but instead of soft cotton, it's a massive, priceless textile that weighs as much as a small child. Rolling them up and hauling them around was a logistical nightmare, but worth it to keep a semblance of home warmth and status wherever they went. And when wars or raids threatened, these tapestries sometimes doubled as makeshift armor for the walls. The thick fabric could absorb arrows or blunt the impact of thrown stones. So, not just pretty, but potentially life-saving. Who knew your decorative blanket could moonlight as medieval body armor? So, as you sit in your chilly chamber, staring at your tapestry, consider the layers of meaning woven into it: comfort, status, storytelling, and survival. It wasn't just a piece of cloth. It was a medieval Swiss Army knife, tailored with thread and sprinkled with a dash of aristocratic flair. Now, take a deep breath. Imagine the softness beneath your fingers, the muted colors telling tales of forgotten battles and saintly miracles, the quiet warmth of wool against the biting stone. Let the tapestry's stories mingle with the flicker of the fire and the steady rhythm of your breath. The medieval world might be harsh and cold, but here, wrapped in history and thread, there's a kind of strange, stubborn coziness. When you're ready, we'll keep weaving through this tapestry of history, literally and figuratively. But for now, let the soft weight of centuries ease your mind. And remember, the next chapter promises even more threads to pull, mysteries to unravel, and maybe a few surprises that might make you thankful for modern heating. Rest easy, my friend. The story is just beginning. You wake up again, this time not in a castle chamber but perhaps in a drafty medieval hall where the cold has settled into your bones like an uninvited guest who never leaves. The walls around you, once resplendent with tapestries, now bare, echo hollowly, reminding you just how crucial those thick fabrics were, not only for warmth but for soundproofing. Yes, that's right, tapestries were the medieval version of noise-canceling headphones, though instead of soft electronic hum, they muffled the ever-present clatter of armored boots, clanking dishes, and the occasional drunken bard's off-key lute performance. Think about it. Castles and great halls were massive stone structures, designed to withstand sieges, but not necessarily to host peaceful conversations or a restful night's sleep. The echo in these rooms would have been deafening, a constant roar of footsteps, voices, metal on stone, and all the other medieval ambience that probably did nothing to soothe your already frazzled nerves. So, the tapestries, besides their obvious aesthetic and insulating properties, played a crucial acoustic role. Their thick wool and dense weaving absorbed sound waves, deadening the cavernous echo, and helping conversations feel less like you were shouting across the Grand Canyon. Imagine trying to have a polite dinner chat without this acoustic cushioning. Your ears would be assaulted by the clatter of chainmail and the endless banging of wooden plates. No thanks. In fact, the acoustic properties of tapestries were so valued that they became an essential feature in royal courts and noble houses where diplomacy, gossip, and intrigue thrived in equal measure. A well-placed tapestry could mean the difference between discreet whispers and public eavesdropping. They were, in essence, medieval soundproof wallpaper. But tapestries were not just about comfort and social signaling. They were also about controlling the environment, physical, social, and even spiritual. The images embroidered onto the fabric carried potent symbolism and messages that transcended simple decoration. These were visual sermons, political manifestos, and mythic epics stitched into fabric. Every thread was a calculated move in a game of power and perception. For example, take the famed unicorn tapestries. On the surface, they're stunning works of art depicting the hunt, capture, and taming of a unicorn. But peel back the layers, and you find a rich allegory about purity, the hunt for the divine, and, quite possibly, a political allegory about control and possession. The unicorn, wild, mysterious, and elusive, is chased down and captured, symbolizing the subjugation of untamed forces, much like a noble lord's claim over rebellious lands or unruly subjects. So when you stare at these tapestries, you're not just looking at pretty pictures. You're gazing into a medieval mind that understood the power of imagery long before Instagram influencers caught on. Each tapestry was a multi-layered message wrapped in beauty and wool. The process of hanging these tapestries was also an event. They weren't thrown up casually like a poster on a dorm room wall. No, this was serious business. Often, tapestries were commissioned for special occasions, marriages, diplomatic visits, or celebrations of military victories. The hanging was a ceremony, an exhibition of wealth, power, and taste, and a way to impress visitors who might otherwise judge you by your lack of hot running water or decent plumbing. And speaking of ceremony, don't forget that tapestries had a role in religious practice, too. Many depicted biblical stories, saints, and moral lessons that helped communicate religious doctrine to a largely illiterate population. They were like silent sermons, gently reinforcing the moral order while keeping you warm and quiet. So, there you are, nestled in your drafty hall, listening to the distant echoes of clanking armor and muffled conversations, wrapped in the soft but weighty embrace of tapestry. The colors, faded but still proud, tell you stories older than you can imagine, stories of kings and peasants, of faith and fear, of power and survival. As you let your eyes drift over the stitched scenes, the textures beneath your fingertips, and the lingering smells of wool and old dust, you realize something profound. These tapestries were more than just practical. They were vessels of history, culture, and human experience, crafted with care in a world that was often cruel and cold. Now, let your mind float with the quiet warmth and the echoes muffled by centuries of thread. Let the tapestry cradle your thoughts as you drift further into a world where every stitch holds a secret and every color whispers a story. When you're ready, we'll continue weaving through this fabric of history, pulling more threads, and exploring how these ancient masterpieces shaped medieval life in ways you might never have guessed. But for now, rest easy, wrapped in the soft embrace of time and thread. You slowly come to, still enveloped in the faint, comforting dimness of a medieval chamber. The tapestry's rough texture brushes gently against your fingertips, as if reminding you that there's more to these woven wonders than just warmth and stories. In fact, what if I told you that tapestries were also a key part of medieval politics and power plays? Yeah, those giant hanging rugs were not just cozy blankets, they were also the medieval social media, without the trolls, but with just as much drama. Picture this, you're a noble lord, decked out in your finest robes, and you want to send a message. No, not a text or a tweet, because those don't exist yet, but a massive, colorful tapestry hanging on your castle walls. This isn't just about decoration. It's about sending a clear signal to guests, rivals, and your own family. Look at me. I'm powerful, cultured, and totally not freezing to death because I have enough money to insulate my walls with hand-woven art. Tapestries were custom-made to showcase lineage, heroic deeds, and political alliances. Think of them as medieval billboards advertising your family's achievements and connections. In a world without Instagram filters, these wall hangings were the only way to brag without sounding desperate or getting banned from the local market square. Sometimes these woven stories commemorated military victories. Imagine a tapestry showing your ancestors triumphantly riding into battle, swords gleaming and horses charging. It was a way to cement your family's reputation and intimidate anyone who might consider challenging your claim to power or just borrowing a cup of sugar without asking. But the political use of tapestries went deeper. They could subtly influence opinion, even spread propaganda. The colors, symbols, and figures were carefully chosen to send messages about loyalty, divine right, and authority. Displaying a particular saint or biblical story could reinforce the idea that your rule was sanctioned by heaven itself. That's a medieval mic drop. On the flip side, tapestries were also used to rewrite history, or at least to put a spin on it. Nobles would commission new tapestries to highlight victories while conveniently ignoring embarrassing defeats or family scandals. Think of it as a medieval version of carefully curated online profiles where the bad stuff is simply deleted or never posted. And here's a fun wrinkle. Sometimes tapestries were gifted or traded like political currency. Presenting a magnificent tapestry as a gift was a grand gesture of alliance or goodwill. Receiving such a gift could boost your social standing or cement a political alliance. It's like exchanging rare NFTs today, but with much better craftsmanship and fewer charging fees. Because tapestries were so valuable and expensive, they were often among the few possessions that survived wars, fires, and looting. They were portable symbols of power and prestige, rolled up and transported carefully when nobles traveled. Imagine lugging around a giant, heavy woven scroll that weighed as much as your awkward teenage cousin. But it was worth it, A tapestry could set the mood in any castle or manor, signaling your arrival and your status. And while tapestries were mostly about nobles and royalty, they sometimes trickled down to the wealthier merchant classes as well. Owning one was a statement. I might not be born to blue blood, but I can still afford to keep my house warm and my social standing intact. It was medieval social climbing, one stitch at a time. But the making of these political tools wasn't simple. Skilled artisans spent years weaving and embroidering with incredible precision. The process required expensive materials, silk threads dyed with rare colors from distant lands, gold and silver threads shimmering in the light, and an artist's eye for symbolism and storytelling. Each tapestry was a masterpiece, a layered narrative crafted in fiber and dye. So as you lie there, wrapped in the ancient fabric, let yourself imagine the hands that made this piece, dedicated, talented, and perhaps grumbling about the endless hours of stitching, and the lords who proudly hung them as proof of power and prestige. You're holding a tangible connection to a world where art was politics, warmth, and history all rolled into one. Let the weight of that thought settle as you sink deeper into sleep, the tapestry's quiet stories humming in your ears. When you're ready, we'll keep pulling on these threads, exploring even more ways medieval people used their woven wonders to survive, impress, and maybe even manipulate their harsh, chilly world. For now, breathe in the past and let the soft, steady pulse of history rock you gently toward rest. You awake again in that familiar medieval chamber, the dim flicker of torchlight casting long shadows over the heavy tapestry hanging on the wall. You stretch your fingers, feeling the rough wool and silk beneath your touch. But now you're thinking about something you probably never considered before, just how the humble tapestry was a vital tool in the medieval battle against bugs. Yes, bugs. Not the digital kind, but the creepy crawlies, the vermin, and the microscopic enemies of hygiene that made life in the Middle Ages a smelly, itchy, and often outright disgusting affair. So before you get too cozy and drift off again, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, especially when we're talking about medieval bug warfare. Alright, back to the pests. Medieval castles and manors were notorious for being downright unhygienic. Stone walls were cold and damp, and floors were often dirt or rough stone, perfect breeding grounds for fleas, lice, and all sorts of unwelcome guests. Personal hygiene wasn't exactly a priority when there was no hot water on tap, and the closest thing to soap might have been a bar of lye or some pine resin. Your mattress smells like betrayal, your clothing probably hasn't seen a proper wash in months, and the bugs had every reason to treat your skin like a five-star buffet. Enter the tapestries, your unexpected bug battalion. Thick wool fabrics acted as a barrier between you and the cold, but they also created a kind of microclimate on your walls, less humid, less prone to mold, and less inviting to pests. By covering the stone surfaces, tapestries reduced drafts and condensation, making the environment less hospitable to creepy crawlies. You can almost imagine the bugs staring up at the tapestries, sighing, and deciding to move on to more damp and delicious quarters. But the tapestries didn't stop at physical barriers. The materials and dyes used sometimes had insect-repelling properties. Some colors were made from plants that medieval people suspected kept bugs away, like woad or madder. It's like an ancient, natural bug spray woven right into your wall coverings. Of course, this was probably more accidental than intentional, but hey, if it worked, it worked. Even better, the sheer thickness of the tapestry made it hard for bugs to cross. Fleas and lice that thrived in hair and on clothes had a tougher time spreading through rooms where tapestries cushioned and isolated the space. In a sense, these woven walls created a buffer zone, a fuzzy moat against the invading armies of itch and discomfort. And speaking of itch, let's not forget that tapestries also muffled some of the less pleasant smells of medieval life. No sewage systems, no running water, and livestock often shared living spaces with humans. You do the math. The wool and silk fibers absorbed some of these odors, making the atmosphere slightly more bearable. Imagine living in a giant stone refrigerator that smells faintly of wet sheep and old breadcrumbs, and then adding a tapestry that acts like a thick, fragrant curtain of not so bad. Of course, tapestries could only do so much. Medieval life was still rife with fleas, lice, bedbugs, and the occasional rat who considered your pantry a buffet. But in a world without bug spray, vacuum cleaners, or even proper windows, tapestries were a crucial line of defense in the ongoing war against pests and general filth. So, as you lie there, tangled in the threads of history and wool, imagine the medieval inhabitants brushing off invisible invaders, grateful for the thick tapestry that not only warmed their bones but also kept their skin from crawling in more ways than one. Let the thought of those ancient bug battles lull you deeper into rest, the soft rustle of tapestry threads whispering tales of survival against the smallest, most persistent enemies. When you're ready, we'll continue to unravel more secrets of these marvelous medieval masterpieces. For now, breathe in the slightly musty, but somehow comforting scent of woven wool, and let the warmth of history cradle you gently toward sleep. You awaken slowly once more, nestled in the soft, muted glow of your medieval chamber, the tapestry's textured fibers pressing softly against your skin like a centuries-old hug. But as you settle in, a question drifts through your mind. Why did these tapestries, these grand works of woven art, often depict such bizarre, vivid, and sometimes downright unsettling scenes? You know the ones I mean: knights wrestling dragons, hunts chasing unicorns, angels battling demons, and an endless parade of medieval animals that look like they were drawn by someone who'd never actually seen a horse. Before you sink too deep into the labyrinth of medieval symbolism, take a quick moment to like and subscribe if you're genuinely enjoying this odd little history journey. And drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always a delight to connect with night owls and history buffs around the globe who are hanging out in these dimly lit corners of the internet. Now, back to the tapestries. These vibrant, fantastical scenes weren't just for entertainment or bragging rights. No, they were deliberate, symbolic stories that communicated complex messages to viewers who often couldn't read. Think of them as ancient graphic novels, except instead of superheroes, they featured saints, mythical beasts, and lots of very angry-looking people in chainmail. Take the famous Hunt of the Unicorn series, for example. On the surface, it's a beautiful tale of a magical beast pursued by noble hunters. But beneath the surface, it's loaded with meaning. The unicorn symbolized purity, Christ, and the unattainable. The hunt could be interpreted as the human soul's quest for the divine or a metaphor for political control. Maybe the unicorn was just really hard to catch, but medieval minds loved layering meaning like a lasagna of theology and politics. Then there's the wild men, huge, hairy humanoid figures covered in leaves or loincloths who appear in many tapestries. They might look like medieval versions of Bigfoot or the kind of guy you'd hope doesn't pop up at your family reunion. These figures symbolize the untamed wilderness, the chaotic forces outside civilization's fragile walls. They reminded viewers of the dangers lurking beyond the castle gates, and maybe, just maybe, the wildness lurking inside every noble lord's temper after a few flagons of mead. But it wasn't all about the terrifying or the mythological. Many tapestries also depicted biblical scenes, Garden of Eden, Last Supper, or the Apocalypse, serving as both moral lessons and reminders of divine power. These images brought stories from sacred text to life for an audience mostly unable to read. Imagine sitting before a tapestry that detailed the fall of man in rich color and texture while trying not to fall asleep on a cold stone bench. The colors themselves were meaningful, too. Certain dyes were rare and expensive: deep blues from lapis lazuli, vibrant reds from madder root, shimmering gold from threads dipped in precious metals. Using these colors wasn't just about beauty. It was about status, about shouting, "Look how much money I have," without using actual words. Because medieval nobles couldn't just wear a shirt that said "I'm rich," they wore walls that said it for them. And the artists behind these masterpieces? They were experts not just in weaving, but in storytelling, symbolism, and probably guessing what their patrons wanted. Many of them remain anonymous to history, but their work survived wars, fires, and revolutions, carrying forward tales that still spark curiosity and wonder. You can almost feel their tired fingers and squinting eyes as they painstakingly work threads into narratives that were meant to last generations. So as you rest there, tracing the imagined patterns of mythical beasts and biblical heroes with your mind's eye, remember that every stitch was a tiny piece of a much bigger story. A story about faith, power, mystery, and the very human desire to make sense of a confusing world. Let these ancient tales mingle with your dreams, softening the edges of history with a gentle warmth of wool and whispered legends. When you're ready, we'll keep wandering through this tapestry of time, exploring even more curious and surprising facets of these medieval marvels. For now, Breathe deeply and let the quiet magic of woven myths lull you gently toward sleep. You slowly come to once more, the faint flicker of torchlight dancing over the heavy tapestry draped along your chamber wall. As your eyes adjust to the muted glow, a thought dawns. How exactly did these tapestries come to be? Who were the people behind these enormous woven wonders? And how on earth did they manage to create such intricate stories with nothing but thread, patience, and probably a whole lot of frustration? Before you settle back in and let your mind drift, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe, only if you're genuinely enjoying this sleepy little history adventure. And please drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's fascinating to see the global village gathered here, quietly unraveling medieval mysteries together. Now, back to the artisans. Creating a tapestry was a monumental task, one that demanded incredible skill, precision, and endurance. It wasn't something you whipped up over a weekend binge-watching shows. Oh no, these pieces took months, sometimes years, of painstaking work. We're talking about giant looms, tiny threads, and a workforce of skilled weavers, often working in workshops buzzing with the low hum of spinning wheels and the occasional frustrated sigh. The process began with a cartoon, a full-size drawing that acted as a blueprint. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a Netflix storyboard, except instead of talking headshots, it was a giant, detailed plan of what the tapestry should look like. This cartoon was pinned behind the warp threads on the loom, so the weavers could follow every line and color precisely. Most tapestries were woven from wool, sometimes combined with silk for highlights, or even threads of gold and silver for that extra "look at me, I'm fabulous" sparkle. The wool was dyed using natural materials, plants, roots, insects, resulting in a palette that ranged from earthy browns and greens to vivid reds and blues. It was an alchemical art, transforming humble sheep's fleece into brilliant works of storytelling. The weavers themselves were often women, highly skilled and respected for their craft. They worked in teams, sometimes under the supervision of a master weaver or an artist who ensured the narrative stayed on point. Imagine sitting for hours, maybe days, knotting threads to depict a single flower or a knight's shiny armor. It was the ultimate test of patience, dexterity, and, perhaps, the ability to tolerate endless gossip. And the workshops? They were hubs of artistic activity and social interaction. Weaving was both an art and a livelihood. Guilds controlled the trade, ensuring quality and protecting secrets, much like today's tech companies guarding their algorithms. These guilds regulated who could weave, what materials they could use, and how tapestries were sold and distributed. Once completed, the tapestry wasn't just tossed into a trunk and forgotten. It was rolled carefully on wooden beams to avoid damage and transported, sometimes hundreds of miles, to its new home. Imagine the logistics of moving a delicate, heavy textile through muddy medieval roads guarded against rain and dirt. It was like carrying an ancient, priceless scroll through a gauntlet of bandits and bad weather. Interestingly, because tapestries were so valuable, they often outlived the stone castles they decorated. While stone crumbled or was repurposed, tapestries could be preserved, passed down, or traded. They were portable art galleries and status symbols wrapped in thread, traveling from court to court like medieval celebrities. So as you rest here, feeling the textured weave beneath your fingertips and imagining the hours of painstaking labor behind every stitch, remember, these tapestries are not just walls. They're a testament to human creativity, endurance, and the ancient desire to tell stories that matter. Let this thought wrap around you as snugly as the tapestry itself, its threads linking you to a past woven with skill and care. When you're ready, we'll continue to unravel more secrets from the loom of history, weaving our way deeper into the medieval world. For now, breathe slowly and let the steady rhythm of ancient craftsmanship lull you gently toward sleep. You awaken once more, the soft glow of flickering candlelight brushing against the tapestry-covered walls around you. The gentle rustle of woven threads feels like an old friend whispering secrets of times long gone. And now, a fresh thought creeps into your mind. What role did tapestries play in the everyday life of medieval people, beyond decoration, politics, and bug defense? What did it actually feel like to live surrounded by these enormous textile giants? Before you sink back into the comforting embrace of history, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. But only if you're genuinely enjoying this sleepy dive into the past. And drop a comment sharing where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's a quiet joy to connect with fellow travelers from all over the globe, united by curiosity and the desire to drift into dreams alongside medieval tales. Life in a medieval castle or manor was often cold, damp, and noisy, a far cry from our modern climate-controlled homes with Netflix on demand. The walls were bare stone, which meant heat was at a premium and sounds echoed like you were living inside a giant bell. Tapestries changed all that. They softened sound, muffling the clatter of armored footsteps, the clang of kitchen utensils, and the endless echo of voices in large halls. Imagine finally being able to hold a conversation without shouting over the ghostly roar of stone. The texture of the tapestries added a warmth to the space, literally and figuratively. Thick wool and silk trapped heat and kept cold drafts at bay. This was especially crucial during the long, harsh winters when indoor fires barely kept rooms warm. Your fingers brushing over the woven patterns would feel the slightly rough, yet comforting, texture, a tactile reminder that something living, human hands, time, care, had brought this piece into existence to make the cold less biting. Tapestries also acted as visual entertainment and storytelling devices for the inhabitants and their guests. Unlike today's screens, these wall hangings offered a permanent, immersive narrative. They were conversation starters, teaching tools, and status symbols, all rolled into one. Imagine being a guest in a medieval hall, your eyes wandering across a tapestry depicting a legendary hunt or a biblical parable, sparking stories and debates while you nursed your goblet of watered-down wine. On a more practical level, tapestries helped keep dust and dirt down. Medieval castles were drafty and dirty places, with animals, servants, and soldiers coming and going constantly. The thick fabric captured some of the airborne grime, making the air just a little less choking and the living space marginally cleaner. Of course, this was medieval clean, so not exactly hotel lobby pristine, but better than bare stone walls where every gust of wind kicked up a mini dust storm. Beyond utility and storytelling, tapestries also reflected the rhythms of medieval life, seasonal hunts, religious festivals, agricultural cycles, all captured in vivid detail. These images connected people to the world outside the castle walls, reminding them of the changing seasons, the divine order, and the endless dance between survival and celebration. For the people living in these spaces, tapestries might have been a constant, quiet presence, seen and touched every day, yet rarely fully appreciated. They were background to the mundane and the extraordinary alike, a tactile comfort in an often unpredictable world. You might run your hand along the wool and feel the echoes of feasts, battles, prayers, and whispered secrets woven into the threads. So as you lie here, wrapped in the imagined warmth and stories of these woven wonders, let the textures and tales mingle in your mind. The crackling fire, the muffled footsteps, the scent of wax and wool, all come together to create a sensory tapestry of their own, gently pulling you deeper into rest. When you're ready, we'll continue to explore more fascinating layers of medieval tapestries, their journeys, their secrets, and their quiet, enduring magic. For now, breathe deeply and let the soft embrace of history's fabric cradle you gently toward sleep. You slowly awaken again, the muted glow of candlelight brushing softly against the tapestry-covered walls of your chamber. The gentle, almost imperceptible whisper of thread shifts with a cool medieval draft, reminding you of stories not yet told. And now, a new question settles in your mind like a feather drifting through a quiet room. What happened to all these magnificent tapestries as time marched forward? How did these medieval marvels survive centuries of war, neglect, and changing taste to still whisper their secrets to us today? But before you drift too deep into that thought, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe, only if this sleepy stroll through history is helping you relax. And please, do share in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's fascinating to know who's joining this late-night weaving of tales from all over the globe. Now, about the survival saga of tapestries, they were more than just wall decorations. They were portable, prized possessions, prized enough to be carefully packed, rolled, and transported across countries and centuries. Unlike stone castles or wooden furniture, tapestries could be moved, hidden, or sold when the tides of power shifted. This portability was a key factor in their survival. During wars and sieges, nobles often took their tapestries with them, rolling these heavy textile treasures onto wooden beams and carefully covering them to protect from mud and rain. Imagine the cumbersome caravan, winding through muddy roads, carrying priceless art instead of luggage or weapons. These tapestries traveled like medieval VIPs, only with less fanfare and more chance of damage from horse manure. Many tapestries found refuge in royal treasuries, monastic collections, or noble estates far from battlefields. Some were repurposed or even cut up for fragments to decorate smaller items, like clothing or altar cloths. Others were hidden away in dusty chests or attics, forgotten as tastes changed and new art styles emerged during the Renaissance and beyond. Unfortunately, this wasn't always a good thing. Exposure to light, moisture, insects, and rough handling over centuries took a toll. Colors faded, threads weakened, and some tapestries were lost entirely to fires, theft, or simply being discarded as old-fashioned. The very portability that saved them also made them vulnerable. Luckily for us, a revival of interest began in the 19th and 20th centuries, when historians and collectors recognized tapestries not just as decorative curiosities, but as priceless windows into medieval life and art. Museums, galleries, and private collectors began restoring and preserving these fragile textiles, painstakingly repairing tiers, stabilizing fibers, and researching their origins. This modern conservation effort is a delicate dance, preserving enough of the tapestry's original beauty and story without erasing the wear and history that make it authentic. Imagine a conservator in a quiet workshop, delicately threading tiny needles through centuries-old wool, their fingers steady despite the weight of history in their hands. Today, many famous tapestries are displayed under controlled lighting and climate conditions to slow their aging. They hang behind glass or are mounted on special frames, allowing viewers to marvel at the artistry while protecting the fragile fibers. Even with all this care, the survival of these tapestries remains a miracle, a testament to human skill, luck, and a deep respect for cultural heritage. So as you lie here, wrapped in the imagined threads of history, think of the countless hands that have cared for these tapestries through the ages. From medieval weavers and noble owners to modern conservators and curious visitors, each has played a part in weaving the tapestry of time itself. Let this thought soothe you, the gentle pulse of centuries vibrating through each thread, connecting past and present in a quiet, timeless embrace. When you're ready, we'll continue our journey into the fascinating world of medieval tapestries, exploring even more secrets stitched into their fabric. For now, breathe deeply and let the steady rhythm of history cradle you gently toward sleep. You awaken again in the quiet hush of your tapestry-lined chamber, the soft folds of fabric whispering around you like old friends telling their last stories before night fully falls. As the candle flickers low, a gentle curiosity stirs. What did the people who owned these tapestries actually think about them? Were these wall hangings merely objects of prestige and utility, or did they inspire wonder, comfort, or even superstition in the medieval hearts that lived alongside them? Before you let that thought settle too deep, take a slow moment to tap the like button and subscribe, only if this sleepy history trip is soothing your mind. And do drop a comment below, sharing where you're joining from and what hour it is. It's always a quiet joy to connect with fellow night travelers on this woven path through time. In the medieval world, owning a tapestry was a sign of serious status, a visible declaration of wealth, taste, and power. But beyond that, these woven stories were imbued with meaning that could stir emotions and influence moods. Imagine walking into a grand hall after a long, bitter winter. The cold stone underfoot, the flickering fire struggling against drafts. Then your eyes land on a vibrant tapestry, alive with scenes of hunts, heroic battles, or serene religious imagery. It was like stepping into another world, a world where stories and ideals wrapped around you as warmly as the fabric itself. For many, these tapestries were a source of comfort and inspiration. They reminded viewers of noble virtues like bravery, faith, and loyalty, reinforcing social order through the images they portrayed. They were also conversation pieces, sparking discussions among courtiers, guests, and family members. Picture the hushed whispers around a tapestry depicting a saint's miraculous deeds, or the spirited debates over the symbolism in a mythical hunt. These textiles were silent companions to everyday life, shaping thoughts and feelings in subtle ways. Yet, superstition wasn't far behind. Some believed tapestries held protective powers, warding off evil spirits or bad luck. In a time when the line between the natural and supernatural was thin and often crossed, hanging a tapestry with religious or mythical scenes was a bit like having a security system powered by angels and dragons. They were talismans woven into the very walls. On a more practical note, the tactile pleasure of running your hand over the textured fabric offered a quiet solace. The rough wool, the shimmering silk, the glint of gold threads, they were reminders of human touch and craftsmanship in a world often harsh and unpredictable. The tapestry was a tangible link to the hands that wove it, the patrons who commissioned it, and the stories that defined their lives. Of course, not everyone viewed tapestries with the same reverence. To some servants and soldiers, these heavy wall hangings might have seemed like just more dusty fabric to clean or awkward obstacles in cramped corridors. But to the noble family, these tapestries were part of their identity, their legacy, and their daily experience of beauty and power. So as you lie there, surrounded by the imagined glow of medieval lamps and the quiet strength of woven stories, let yourself feel the gentle presence of these ancient companions. They were more than just decoration. They were the echoes of lives, dreams, and beliefs woven together in thread and time. Let this thought settle around you like the soft folds of a tapestry, drawing you gently toward rest. When you're ready, we'll pause here, but remember, the story of these woven wonders is endless, and whenever you return, there will always be more threads to explore. For now, breathe slowly and let the warm embrace of history cradle you softly toward sleep.